Welcome back, fight fans. This video is brought to you by AB Combat. The UFC are trailblazers within the world of combat sports for a reason, but that doesn't mean that they're immune to making a weird decision or two every now and then. Decisions that left their fans baffled, to say the least. Here are 10 UFC changes that confuse the fans. The championship belts. To kick things off, we have a classic case of the UFC messing with something that no one truly asked them to. The old UFC belts were the thing that every young fighter aspired to. Sure, it's just a strap with a lump of gold on it, but those belts were the same design that had been handed out for decades. So when the UFC decided to scrap the old belt and bring in a new, slicker, more undeniably modern model, fans were left scratching their heads. Sure, you can read the wording of the UFC's name clearer, but the other belt had history, a sense of legacy, and it was immediately familiar. A strange choice. New weigh-ins. A few years ago, the UFC ceremonial weigh-ins, you know, the one with Joe Rogan, the stage, and all the ring girls, that event was actually used for the official weigh-in reading. However, in an effort to make weight cutting less strenuous, the UFC kept that ceremonial event, but made the actual official weigh recording happen hours beforehand. Instead of giving fighters more rehydration time, however, this arguably just encouraged these athletes to try and cut more weight. A weird decision, and the fact that we have two weigh-ins in the one day is undeniably confusing. Post-fight press conferences. You're going to start noticing a trend here, but the UFC have a habit of messing with a good thing. The whole "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" philosophy seems to have washed over Dana and co. And one of the biggest cases of pointless changes came when they decided to mess with post-fight press conferences. Back in the day, you could watch 4, 5, maybe even 6 fighters fielding questions at the same time. Fighters who just shared the cage together, all on the one stage. These days, it's a lot less fun. Post-fight pressers are always one fighter at a time, and if you ask us, it makes no sense. The new judging system. There are a lot of problems with the 10-point must system for MMA, but the fact that there are now 2 different scoring criteria operating in the UFC is baffling. Each has minor differences to scoring systems and to the rules around grounded opponents, and all this does is create an imbalance within the sport, while confusing not only the fans, but likely a lot of the fighters and coaches as well. This one needs fixing, folks. Interim titles for all. Believe it or not, interim titles used to mean something, or at the very least, they were used with some real purpose when a champion could not defend his title, holding the division up. These days, having an interim title fight is an excuse for the UFC to try and make a pay-per-view event read a little better on paper, and for any newcomer fans, it's bound to be a point of confusion, like, yes, that fighter is celebrating with a UFC belt, but no, he's not actually the champ. You know what we mean? The women's featherweight division. The idea of a women's featherweight division actually makes a whole lot of sense. As the sport continues to grow, it's only right that more and more fighters should get their chance to be represented in the top flight, and the idea of a women's MMA cutting off at 135 pounds doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what makes even less sense is the current state of the 145-pound weight class. It was originally created to give the legendary Chris Cyborg a division to rule over. However, Amanda Nunes would eventually rise up and KO her with a round, becoming a double champ in the process. And look, if you want to put on fights at 145 pounds, that's perfectly reasonable. In fact, it's a great idea. But years later, Nunes has a championship belt that she sometimes defends, but the division barely has a roster. It doesn't have rankings, and of the 7 fighters that are listed as active within its weight class, most of them compete at 135 pounds primarily. It's a weird one, and the time to either build the division or axe it entirely is likely fast approaching. The ESPN deal. The UFC's old pay-per-view model had its issues, Sure, but their deal with ESPN really made things complicated and much more expensive for their fans. These days, if you want to watch the fights, you have to ensure that you have your streaming subscription set up before you then try to buy the pay-per-view. And if you're not in the US, things get pretty tricky on that front. You can no longer buy events directly through Fight Pass. Increased roster size. With more yearly shows required, it only makes sense that the UFC would have to sign up more fighters. The problem with this? Well, back in the day, the UFC had a certain level of exclusivity about it. Only the very best fighters would even be considered, if they weren't already fighting in Japan. These days, fans are sure to be confused by some of the skill levels on display in the UFC. Sometimes they give contracts to guys who are just clearly not of the elite level. And as a fan of the sport, it's becoming harder and harder to know just how far the UFC are actually ahead of their competition. The Apex. Look, there's nothing wrong with the Apex on its own. In fact, like Fight Island, this Vegas-based fight venue was actually instrumental in allowing the UFC to put on shows in a time where no other sports were operating. But its continuing existence is basically ensuring that we get more than a few pretty underwhelming fight cards per yet. With the ESPN deal and the increased roster size that comes with it, UFC Apex Fight Night events are basically used to fill a slot on the calendar, and it certainly waters down the quality of the product. The Reebok deal. And finally, we come to a big one. When the Reebok deal came to fruition, there was at least some chance that it might be good for all of those involved. The UFC certainly tried to spin it that way, but when the fans were made privy to the truly meager payouts that would replace any sponsorships fighters previously would have adorned their shorts with, it became clear that this was a bad move. Not only were the athletes losing huge money-making potential through finding their own sponsors for their fight kits, but on a more surface level, these bland, boring fight shorts sucked the life out of each fighter's unique look. You guys remember the Chuck Liddell Iceman shorts and Tito Ortiz's black flaming kit? Well, those days are long gone, and while most fans understand that the UFC are just trying to make more money, it doesn't make this one any more digestible. Thanks for watching, fight fans. We'll be back soon.